Welcome everybody to this next talk with Darren Silk. My name is Victoria. I'm your compere for the session, and Daniel will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we've got about 10 minutes for Q&A. So please be thinking of the sort of questions that you might want to ask. Very delighted to welcome Darren to give us our talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Darren Silk. I'm the 3 times great-grand-nephew of Matthew Allen, who built Allen's estate in Stoke Newington, along the Manor and Bethune roads. And we're going to talk a little bit about how the estate was influenced by Mannerism, and looking into actually recreating parts of the gardens and other parts of the buildings that don't longer exist anymore. When was Mannerism? We'll be looking into this period trapped between Renaissance and Baroque, and between the Sacco of Rome and the style of sort of that sort of shell-like architecture that came on afterwards. And is looking at, you have the Victorian Revival periods, and you have Renaissance Revival, Baroque Revival, but there's this sort of element of Mannerist Revival that's also in there in Victorian Revivalist periods. There's a little brief looking at the idea of Mannerism as a concept, looking at it from a painting angle, looking at the fact that Renaissance paintings are very sort of human-like, very humanist, very sort of more matter-of-factly presented, compared to Mannerists, where you're looking at sort of elaborations on things. You're looking at the fact that things are also referencing further back to history, so looking further back to antiquity and bringing that forward. As in, for example, if you're looking at the Last Supper scene here, and they've sort of recreated the Last Supper done in the Mannerist period, you're actually looking at, you're seeing much more of a scene being created here. You're actually seeing people serving people. You're seeing more different types of people, different people from across the world. And you're seeing this idea that if that event was occurring in the present time of when that was painted, rather than this sort of clean, sterilized recreation of what it was then. So, and there's obviously a lot of play in there. It's actually so controversial they had to rename the painting to House of Levi. And they're looking at also, in terms of sculpture, you're looking at very anatomical forms rather than being, and that's in the Renaissance, being more anatomical forms, and then these elongated, more stylized forms, and you start coming into the Mannerist period. So the funniest thing is it almost looks more real when it's more stylized, and it's also the idea that you're breaking out statues from their locked-in positions. For example, here with Cellini, this is Cellini ironically trapped in an alcove, despite the fact his Mannerist statues are meant to be viewed from around. And you'll notice this is parts of the garden, things are meant to be viewed from the around, rather than this sort of idea of a big facade facing the street. Looking at the statue here of Medusa, slaying Medusa, and if you look carefully, the actual subject is actually Cellini's partner, and actually the head being held aloft isn't actually the head of a female model, it's the head of a younger male model for the part of their studio. And the back of the head of the statue is actually Cellini's own face. So people are commissioning things here where they're talking about this antiquity element of slaying the Medusa, when it's more talking about things like age, historicism, and somebody aging through time. And it's all about these 3 different ages of people. And then we're looking at also that there's key elements to Mannerism. We're looking at the variety, monotony, abundance, brevity, style, decorum, clarity, obscurity, supply and demand, and beauty, monstrosity. These are categories that have sort of been formulated by John Shearman when he was looking at Mannerist categories for way to study it and understand it, compared to, say, Baroque or Renaissance. Also, the fact is that you have this sort of transition in architecture as well, where you have buildings that are locked into the street scene and being these sort of palazzos trapped in, whereas then you start going into the period of Mannerist, you got going to villa architecture, and then instead you're actually dealing with countryside restraints and plot restraints. And of course, in the Allen's estate, it's actually a very awkward plot shape if you actually look at the understanding of the plot compared to, say, quite simple plots, rectilinear plots that you see much earlier. So why is it Mannerism is this sort of linking between the progress of his style, why before and currently there's Mannerism? So if you're looking at when he grew up, he was living around a lot of classical revival and Italianate revival buildings in the Georgian period. And as he got older, he built a lot of the stuff, the improved industrial dwelling symphony. in this Renaissance Revival period. And then he was exhibited at the Exposition Universelle in Paris. And then he started taking a lot of influence in the French Second Empire. But both of the originators of those revival periods, the actual things being referenced, were highly Mannerist. And as you can see from here, his earlier buildings actually reference this building here, Villa Farnese, and Jan's estate directly referenced Chateau Fontainebleau. And Vignola actually was taken in by Primaticcio to work on Fontainebleau before Villa Farnese. And the irony is, Alan worked in reverse. He was looking at the quite typical Renaissance Revival buildings in that sort of Mannerist period, and then ended up producing these early on and this later on as the Allen's estate. So these are the old IDC buildings, the Improved Industrial Weighings Company. And these are the ones that are referencing these Villa Farnese and the early Mannerist style of building. And then this is the Allen's estate, looking at the typical block on the far corner, which is block type C. And this is showing that he's directly referencing that elevation of Fontainebleau. Also, behind Allen's estate is actually the Fontainebleau wild service trees. So there is a direct link there between the architecture and the garden planting. This here's a aerial view overlooking as it is now, and this is how it was back then in 1876. So it's 150 years difference between these two. And you notice this large swath of outbuildings and other components that aren't up there anymore that partly went in the 60s and 70s. But I'm going to guide you through all those components now. So the variety and monotony, because you've got industrial production, you can produce large-scale buildings at low cost that enable you to produce these facilities that allow you to grow vegetables and things you otherwise wouldn't be able to grow. And also the vineries as well. When these were the glass houses that sat along, so that each one of these paths denotes the path to the central form of one of the main blocks of buildings off the left-hand side. And these glass houses, L-shaped glass houses, that connect through into wash houses, connect through to a kitchen garden. That's the scale of the glass houses compared to the Palm House of Kew and the Giges Camellia House. So in grand total, they're about 100 feet long, give or take about a few feet. These allow you to grow vines up inside, full way across the ceiling, up to the back end wall, and they also had low-level pottering areas as well. And that's a view you get from the back end of the houses. You descend down the large steps to the rear end of the housing blocks. This is the views you get at the far end to the north. So this is you arrive down from those paths to these glass houses. So each block would have a pair. And this is connecting now as you get into the promenade here. So there's this long promenade for these components plug into. These here are the vineries, where the vines are growing from behind them. And the whole idea of this, it would offer you the abundance that you wouldn't get in a normal middle-class house. You'd end up with so much more produce and growing capacity than you would have in a conventional terrace house. And as you can see, the remnants on the roofs of these existing buildings, they are actually these components here reused. And this dance hall building here, the lantern is actually also components reused from here as well. So you can actually see on the existing houses, these components repeated. And there's an example of a garden from the Mannerist period, Baroque more to the top and southern ends. But this shows this sort of linear patterns of pathways connecting to feature points, and then a connecting perpendicular pathway that links along its facing. So there's a lot of this level change in Mannerist gardens that you don't quite get in Renaissance gardens. Renaissance gardens are more obsessed with the symmetry, and also the fact is that you're dealing more here in Mannerist gardens with existing conditions, because a lot of these are built on castle lands and such, whereas Matthew Allen's creating that idea of this elevated walkway on what would otherwise be completely flat fields. The abundance and brevity of the kitchen garden offers incredible amounts of produce for the people that live there. And this is behind those. So this is the scale. It's a half an acre kitchen garden with numerous outbuildings, very similar to those seen at Oxford Estate. So these sort of little single story elements at the far end here and here. approximately, if you really pushed it, you could probably feed 200 people with that amount of land, particularly you grew types like beans and potatoes and those kind of foods. And if you look further along, there's the promenade, which is this element here. So the glasshouse you saw earlier here, this is the large promenade section. And that is about the same length again, 400 feet long in total, and incorporates the vineries at the front, wash houses underneath, coach arch, and more wash houses, and then punctuated by the dance hall. So this is the actual main dance hall building, the garden parlour it's sometimes called, and he's directly referencing places like Versailles and other buildings of the similar era. And he's actually using, instead of the dormer windows, which are slightly later, slightly just coming to the Baroque period, that he's referencing them as these sort of shields done in brass to reflect the light and catch the light as you approach on a coach road coming in. So this would act like a set like fascinators effectively, and you come down and you can actually see them from aerial photographs taken in the 30s from a biplane. They actually get a bit of glint on them. And these are the orangery parterre at Versailles. And you can actually even see in the dance hall, there's elements just taken from them with these corner planting, these sort of regular spacings of these U's put here, but on a smaller scale for, small domestic middle class scale. So he's offering a much grandiose form of living compared to people who would otherwise have these small terrace rows, small sort of plot gardens. And then the idea of a gloriette is the garden parlour itself. And this here is the Chateau d'Arnette, and this is smack bang in the middle of the Mannerist period. Ironically, the little carved section at the top of the doorway is the same as the one referencing from Versailles. There's actually that carving is the same because it's taken from that. And the building is built in the same sort of stacked arrangement with raising staircases, these curved walls, the idea of this sort of focal element at the top. And you can see here, this is the staircase that actually comes up here into the billiard room. And he's playing with the idea of the sort of balustrade there and precast concrete components. So everything you see is grey as precast concrete components. And there's also this idea of, going back to antiquity again, the idea of a temple on a mount. And one of the major Mannerist villas is Al Ramdini. And this is the view you hear, this incomplete portico, basically. You're looking at the idea that this geometry is actually completing this shape in a very similar manner with this sort of zinc or leaded up stand on the roof. I worked out the geometry in that, and that works it in about a quarter of a brick. So it is actually to brick dimensions to how it's built historically. And the idea is that if you sat on the balconies looking out at the third story, you would actually see this lantern as a very similar to this temple on the mount idea. So you're looking out across that, and you can actually see that from pretty much all of the backs of the apartments. Coming back again, also antiquity, but domesticity as well in the billiard room, because his earlier buildings, the mansion blocks, have these standardized components, standard room heights, but variation as they go up. He must have been designing the billiard room, at the same time as these flats here. So these 1872, designed back approximately 1871, and that dimension there of that living room, of that apartment, is the exact same dimensions as that billiard room, including all the same components carried across. And these are his own invention, a sash window with a fixed panel beneath, but that allowed you for living components to have a private area underneath, so people can't really see you from the street. But in here, it stops the interruption of the billiards as people pass by on the promenade. And this is where it responds directly back to antiquity. We're looking at a building that was excavated in Pompeii in 1809. So this would have been quite publicised in quite a few publications at the time. And this shows the H-beam construction with this Gavideum and impluvium below, which would have been a pool of water. And he's actually structurally done the exact same thing with this H-beam, and then used it to light the pool table. And I worked out the structure of that roof actually lines up with our house, because he built our house in Cambridgeshire using the same beam construction and arrangements and spacings. So you can actually, that's recreated using actual dimensions. But he's actually referencing this arrangement here, instead of water being climb down there is treating it as light rather than water. A lot of the Mannerist gardens and houses have an element of the style and decorum to them, and there's the idea that this is directly referencing the Cour d'honneur and the Cour de Marbre at the side. So it's taking the exact same form, and there's a Mannerist thing is where you can also invert things. So instead of having what would be an outdoor space as a courtyard and a palace, you suddenly set out your internal space to be set out in a similar manner. So you actually have this inversion of the idea between the two. Whereas if you were doing it as a Renaissance, if you're applying it from a Renaissance angle, you wouldn't be exploring those different avenues. And this is a view inside the dance hall. And this is the full recreation here. And these fireplaces are the fireplaces that would have been at Alan's garden. They're also in concrete. And all the other components painted in marble, all concrete. And you can just see the piano at the end. And this is the pianoforte, or square piano as it was then, before you got uprights. And this is the idea that this back end of the dance hall is actually chamfered walls for the fireplaces, offset keyboard, and the heat comes from one side to you. So you're obviously not heating up as you're playing it. But the sound, when you kick the board back, just like Renaissance and Mannerist era instruments, the sound is put back to you and reflected back down the building. With the chamfered walls in the back of this hall, that sound is reverberated back down the hall again. So it's actually being designed for sound. Clarity and obscurity. The alleys, the platoon, and the cottage. So we're looking at just by the archway as you come down the long entrance driveway. And this is sort of a breakdown of the accesses. So you've got the main coach roads coming along and access to the end. These are service routes that are obscured by high hedges. So you can't see people taking your bed sheets and washing to the end of the drive as you go down. But the main decorative routes, where you come down on these grand staircases that have little areas you can pause on, you can look down and you don't end up interrupting each other. So if you're going about your daily business doing some washing, other people are going about, meeting friends and things like that without having to inconveniently meet each other or some people are carrying things. So you've got this sort of woven garden where you've got two layers operating simultaneously. And you can also see that by the platoon, the planting. It obscures from certain angles views down, so it offers a bit of privacy. In other views, it actually parts away, so you can actually look down between them. And the actual the coach house is here, and the archway. And on the left-hand side is the garden parlour, and between that is actually a cottage built into the promenade. And it's basically set out like a sort of 2-3 bed small terrace, effectively. And that obviously offers security for the main hall and the coaches. But that's the view of the garden you have at the back there. See, if this had been more in a Mannerist style, Renaissance style, this thing would have been not designed to be viewed for around. You wouldn't see this. This would be more designed to be flat, less stacked, and more rectilinear. Whereas this is actually preempting the Baroque revival period that you see later on in the late Victorian period. Supply and demand, the ups and the stables. This offers the convenience to the people that live there, but also bringing in items from the nearby train station. As you look at the Cour de Marbre from Versailles, you can see that obviously workmen coaches would come down that open courtyard and be received by being able to see the time. And then this is the same idea, that they've broken out into individual components. So you actually have this mechanical clock, very similar to those that you see at stations, about the same size as a station clock. So it would have had been an addition for the actual purpose. And you can actually see here that another example of Renaissance gardens at Farnese is the idea of this stacked promenade looking down, the idea of platoons of trees offering different kinds of views and splitting the views in particular manners. And frame views, the Parterre Français and the coach road. This is the approach road coming in from the corner at the junction. And the parterres are the lawns, which are essentially bowling greens. And you would have originally had a long view from this long lawn here through all those bowling greens to St Andrew's Church at the far end. So you see that gable just about here in the clearing past the terrace row. And that's why there's a long hedgerow here, just to isolate your view away from the backs of the houses when you're looking up from here. And unusual features of the fact is that they have these ball piers that we rarely ever see them anywhere other than on Mannerist buildings in France, predominantly, and also Vanbrugh, which is a little bit later, but he's obviously referencing earlier buildings. And there's this sort of square form pinnacle and a split ball. And these are also the same as those on the back of the apartments that hold up the balconies. So they act as a wayfinding around the estate. So that's a view there looking down the long path towards where that coach road is. This is about part of the way along the long path, and this is the same exact view as it was in 1876. So that's a historical photograph there, and that indicates you can see the ball piers here on these bathroom tops, and these clear views to them through the trees once they've matured. So we've mapped out all these trees, and these are the positions they're actually planted in. And looking at Palazzo Pamphili, it's looking at it's an idea of this building punctuating through this promenade and then having looking down on these laid out lawns and planting. And as we mapped out the trees, we actually worked out you can actually see through those trees areas to see the church, the glass houses, and the lantern with the church far end as well. So these have all been set out very deliberately. And then looking at the long lawn, which is on the southern end, which is this sort of triangular shaped lawn. And you'll see here that the perspective is forced because it's a triangular shaped lawn. That's the coach road in, is here and here. And then you see a little patch of lawn at the end currently. And this is now gardens of these houses here with the railings round. But this long lawn plays a trick perspective. It makes it look much longer than it is by tapering at both ends like this, which is a sort of Mannerist trick rather than using very sort of plain matter-of-fact Renaissance style laying out of gardens. And that's obviously as a result of the awkward plot size. Now, the idea is that also the wash houses. There's no water features throughout any of the gardens as original. However, Matthew Allen's relationship with water and services, he was obsessed with making sure everybody had good quality services. So for him, he's taken this idea of the actual under the promenade is actually the wash facilities for washing things like bed sheets, other items. And these are behind the glass houses here. But he also used water collecting in there to be able to wash the floors and things like that, because the roof is a large container, effectively, waterproof container. But he's playing a bit of a game. The fact is, using these Mannerist ideas of garden layouts with grottos underneath, wet areas underneath, instead of being for artistic purposes and leisurely, they're actually utilitarian. The estate itself is entirely made of this reinforced concrete, or as they called it, artificial stone at the time. And it's also harks back to a lot of the artificiality produced in the Mannerist period, including the artificiality of painted statues, the way that they treated certain mouldings and sculptures. And this is an example of some of the material itself that I have from some of our outbuildings. This is a Greek creation of random cement. It relies on a lot of the similar principles: lime, ash, coal, substituting volcanic material from Vesuvius. This is another building, Morrison's buildings, and he's taking these little niches from here, but in this element, they're actually used for oil lamps. So when you're around the garden, you can actually find your way around later in the evening if you're having a dance. And that's why those little piers you see around the garden, those little concrete piers, are flat topped. You can sit on them and you can put your oil lamps on them, because each household would have had their own. And again, from Leopold buildings, again, from the one building we saw earlier, this is actually one of the coal stores at number 20, is actually taken from this. So we knew full well that he's designed this building that early. And there's a bit of a reference to a Roman idea, antiquity again, is opus reticulatum, which was a way of reinforcing wall to these diamond-shaped sort of pyramidal elements that fix into a wall to keep it stronger. And they sort of face over the top of it with a render. But once they've all fell out, when you've seen them after over a period of time, as these antique elements, all those little opus reticulum fell out. So you get this inverted triangle shape, which is referencing that because they are actually chamfered as well. And this is the recreation we was talking about, was the idea of, is one of the Renaissance grotto, but it's looking at the idea of these plant-like elements are being recreated. And you notice with the Victorian pottery at the time as well, also comes back that they're literally referencing these Mannerist plates, using where they'd actually put these elements, Felipe actually put them also in these grottos. So he actually cast them like for like, lizards and other small elements. So when you're looking at the benches, he's actually specifically chose these benches to recreate this bark structure, and he's making deliberate references back to something being obviously artificial as opposed to natural. And these would have been painted these kind of bright colours as well. And that's the view looking along the long lawn there. And this is just a sort of look into the idea that, this is this Mannerist reference going on in the Victorian period, as opposed to all being Renaissance or Baroque Revival. There's a building in King's Lynn that's labelled as a Renaissance Revival building, but yet all the buildings it references directly are all Mannerist. So its features are Mannerist. So the idea of this stacking primary element at the top, a bit like Porta Pia by Michelangelo. You've got these double-layered columns, taking references from numerous buildings of the Mannerist period. And also, again, these Mannerist features coming through again as these vulpias, they're intersected. So you've got this sort of unspoken part of the Victorian Revival period that actually has a lot of references directly back to Mannerist era. And these are a lot of the references I've used to assemble the material for this. Also, Liturgies of Hackney is a great book if you can get a copy of it from the front. That's an overview of the model there, essentially. So all these bends don't exist anymore. So that's a model of it as it was there in 1876. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Darren. That was super. Have we got any questions for Darren?
What happened to all this? I mean, I don't think it was bomb damaged. Was it just dismantled?
Yes, from the maps, the evolution of the OS maps, there's a series, I think in the 1917, 1918 for the First World War, the glass would have been quite hard to get hold of. So the glass houses, the major glass houses at the end, the 400 feet long ones, those gradually degraded, but they were kept still standing and they're still visible in aerial photographs from the 30s. But then as things got on, because people couldn't get the bitumen to repair all the flat roofs, they focused on the houses by the looks of it. And then a part of the dance hall between left of if you're facing the garden room, that left-hand side partially collapsed because water ingress, as it hadn't been maintained. And I think sometime around the 60s and 70s, that dance hall, the cottage and the arch were knocked down, about 72. And then after that, everything else degraded. But the wall that's part of the community garden, the far end, that is still the original promenade wall. That's still there. So in that far corner. And you can actually see remnants in the ground of actual parts of the archaeology. It was how we managed to work out the scale of all this. So there's actually bits of foundation. If you look carefully amongst the sort of hedgerows.
Darren, can you talk about how the shared facilities would work? So if I live there, can I just say I want the dance hall next Tuesday?
Yeah, they had a management, but they did have a management for it, and it was sort of set up in the deeds, because I've read some of the deeds at the Hackney archives.
But so there might be a whole procedure for getting dance hall, but getting a wash house.
Oh, everyone had their own for each. There's enough.
So there's one for every.
There's one for every single one of the wash houses. Yeah.
Coaches.
The coach house, that was shared. So you would have had, from what I could work out, you had two coaches, one probably a summer, one probably a covered winter coach. And it worked out you had two horses, because that little cottage area, if you know the back of the cottage with the dance hall, the little dance hall on the left, we had that little garden at the back. There's two back-to-back horse stables. So they looked over by the actual garden manager, effectively, would take care of the two horses at the back.
So everybody has.
No, it's just two horses for the carriages. That's the whole estate served by two horses. Oh, the carriage was shared. So there's a summer type carriage.
My share.
I think from the grand total, there was, I think it was about, back then, there's probably about 8 per flat. So there's 8 per block, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 6, and then another 8. So quite a few people sharing that carriage between them. But back here, you've got to think about the days where everything's quite nearby. You'd only use that for day tripping. And
Thanks, Darren. Super interesting. Can you tell us a bit about the facilities inside the flats? And so they're quite different from the other buildings around. So
Yeah.
is this a super fancy place to live?
it would have afforded you the same sort of living as you'd expect at a small country house, effectively, but for somebody on a middle class wage. So you would have had, I've actually read in the deeds, they had baby baths, plumbed baby baths. So you had a major family bath and a baby bath in the same room together, just in the flats. So some cleaners lived on site in the ones under, in the lower flats, and they were all to the same standard, because he seemed to be obsessed with making sure they might have been 5 rooms instead of 9, but they would have been up to the same quality. So wallpapered, painted marble effect everywhere, and things like that.
Who were the people there, and how did they either opt or get chosen to live there, and how long?
Well, from the deeds, there's also lease agreements. So he leased the land from the church, and then he owned the buildings themselves. But he also leased some of the buildings to other people to get the rents from them. But there was sort of like a sort of hand-me-down kind of payment system where I take a bit, you take a bit, and that takes a bit in the end. But they weren't much out of the realms of the pricing for a similar sort of 4-bedroom terrace, large size, so typical middle class housing. But you because they'd all this idea of these shared facilities made huge savings that you could, and also the roof and the reinforced concrete reduced the prices of them down by about by 17%. So that's the savings. So you're sort of passing all these savings down. And I think the people lived there for quite a long time, including his daughters and their granddaughters lived there as well. And they all lived in the estate right up till the 1970s, thereabouts. And that's when it changed to a housing association.
If you look at the diagram of the picture there, I looked at the Big Ben here.
Yeah.
What can it tell us about the length of that building?
Oh, the length of it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's I'll just go back round. The length, it's in comparison to the size of say we got Big
Yeah,
Ben.
it's the shape, how it will look at in the future, like a bow shape.
And this is just demonstrating the length of that promenade, and the fact is the Big Ben's 315 feet tall, and the promenade's 400 feet long, and the glass house is also 400 feet long as well. So in grand total, the whole thing is 800 feet long.
So this is like an example of how it will look.
Scale-wise, yeah, that's the exact scale to that, as you see, yeah, basically, yeah.
And it has got to do with in old centuries. And it's telling us how it will look in 2026 like that. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
You just mentioned some respect to the church.
Yes.
What's the was Alan the owner of the freehold of the church land?
The church owned the land and owned the buildings.
When you say the church, do you mean St Andrews itself?
No, it was the Ecclesiastical Commission for England. Yes.
Church Commission.
Yeah, the church commissioners had control over it, yeah.
And also Alan Terrace, Alice Gardens.
Yes, and Alan's Gardens, yes. They had, for the land, apart from the back half, so everything behind the promenade here was owned by Alan outright because it's proximity to the railway. So he owned all the kitchen garden and the stables and all that part himself, but he obviously kept it for free use to everybody else.
So I believe the church commissioner sold off the whole Bethune Road in the 1950s.
Yeah, I think that was why the ownership changed of the estate as well. I think we only come to the 70s. I think the Allens had still connections to the 66, I think.
I'm just thinking in terms of within the 19th century, whether there was any precedent for this scale of communal facilities in commercial mansion block buildings. I'm just thinking of Maida Vale, St John's Wood, that's the area you usually think of, not Hackney. I just wondered is this a Hackney particular? What is this? Are there other examples where this approach was pursued?
I yet to find other examples done like this at all, and also particularly with built with a feature building like sort of gloriette to be viewed in the round. So it's not very common at all, and particularly an inland promenade that's 800 feet long. It's just, I mean, the only thing you could have it on scale was probably one of the giant houses like Rest Park or something. And that's also another reference to the fact is you're having these facilities that from a country house for effectively just ordinary people, really.
The scale of the glass houses must have produced a huge amount of fruit or
Yes.
like exotics.
Yeah.
Were they all consumed by the owners of the house, or was there a commercial business involved?
We know full well that the gardener manager, he had, well, they lived in the cottage, he had, used to come around in the mornings with lists and says, what would you like to, and you put money in to basically to keep him, you know, in financial good standing so that he would be able to continue working, basically. So it was affecting kind of like a full-time job, really. But I don't think there was any sold from what we know of. I think it was all mainly kept within the estate, but I have no examples of any commercial activity. So it's a lot, isn't it? It's a lot.
I was just asking, there are some of the photos that you shot, historical ones. Are they held at Hackney Archive to view all?
These ones are not in a Hackney Archive. They're some of my own and some people that have been referenced that were published online. But there is the intention to put a lot of this into the archives as well as also obviously copies of these presentations, because they need, you know, this stuff needs to be there for people to be able to access it.
That was really nice. Thank you, Darren. I was just curious, like you say, around the 1970s, the handover happened. And like, could you just tell briefly, like, if you know, if the houses have undergone quite a drastic change, or how have they changed from then to now?
Yeah, I was invited in nicely by one of the ladies that lived, I think it was 20, and we had a chat and look around. And I think that was one of the 5-room flats, the slightly smaller ones, the ground floor. And the spaces are quite similar. Door positions appear to be quite similar from what I've seen. Basically, you saw the idea of that dance hall with the wallpapering, the faux marbling and that kind of thing. That's the kind of standard you expect all the interiors to be decorated to. So you'd have all the doors would be faux wood grain, marble effect everywhere on the skirtings, which were cast concrete. So there's concrete skirtings to stop them from rotting, and concrete fireplaces painted and decorated. So I don't think there was much left in the renovations, because there was some renovations done about 2000, I think. There wasn't a lot left behind, but I managed to sort of glance at some specific elements that look very similar to the elements in our house, because he used the same molds, you see. So everything he made was repetition. That's why the cost got so reduced. But the spaces are about the same. Some of them has some of the bits moved around, mainly around bathrooms. That's the areas that have been rejigged, I think, since they were before.
You talked about a housing association. Is that, who knows what now?
I think it's either Hammond Group, or is it right now that it's Riverside? That's the name. Yeah.
Fascinating presentation. Can you shed light on who owns the public accessed gardens? Is it the City Local Corporation? Because I know there's a gate there.
Yeah, I think it's Hackney Council own the land behind now. So that's everything from, because they parted the gardens you see in here. The current railings for the houses are about here. We've included part of the old lawns into the gardens. And this area here, all the way down, including the coach house and the long lawn at the end, that area is all Hackney Council managed. And apart from the growing communities in the far corner, which is the coach yard, here, that's the growing communities garden in the corner. And that promenade wall still exists. And these have been enclosed now as part of the gardens of the flats to the Manor Road.
And yeah, what a brilliant talk. Thank you so much, Darren.